Hello. I got the information from Inkdex for the past events that went on this weekend, which was the Birmingham and Vegas events. And I think it's good to look over them and see sort of what you might have predicted to be true and what you might predict to be wrong, and you can forecast going forward as well. Of course, people will probably also want to forecast as well, so and try and think, right, if I go to the next event like Seattle, which is what I'm looking at, they might think, right, how do I try and beat this meta if this meta was playing at Seattle? So all I'm trying to make from that rambling statement is don't overanalyze this too much. It's very clear what the best decks are right now in the meta, which is Ruby Sapphire and Steel Song. But of course, Green still had a lot of room to work in there. I think a lot of that came from the fact that Green still just wasn't being very much looked at or checked. So there's a lot of environment for people to basically get really strong green steel runs this past weekend, and that's what we saw in Vegas. But I think going forward, if you were to think, right now I'm expecting green steel, I'll probably work in some of those Diablo answers that I had in previous sets. So you've got things like Pegasus and the Peter Pan Shadow, and any steel deck can just put more early answers for a Diablo into their deck if they want to. So yeah, like I say, don't overanalyze it too much. I think green steel will still be around. People want to net deck it and play it. But overall, I wouldn't think too hard on this data. I think the metas will probably end up being very similar in Seattle, with maybe an increase on the green steel, or just don't overanalyze it too much. Ruby Sapphire will end up being the winner in Birmingham, and green steel was the winner in Vegas. I mean, congrats to both of them. That's awesome. And I'll talk about Ruby Sapphire's run. Of course, it's just a very consistently strong powerhouse deck. I think as long as you don't match into a lot of the early aggressive decks like hyper aggro, your run should be fine. I know they kind of have a bit of a bad matchup to Ruby Amethyst, but I think overall a lot of the top players would say it's relatively fine, as long as you're thinking about that matchup as well, because you are expected to see quite a few of them. And then on top of that, they just feed on all of the steel songs and hopefully get 2-0s from them there. So Ruby Sapphire being at the top, of course, it had like I saw numbers. It was like 30% meta shares or something ridiculous like that. So about 400 of them turning up. A majority of them have to convert to day two because just through sheer force, there's so many of them and it's such a strong deck that it ends up being day two. And in TCG terms, hyper control decks usually do well. They kind of take a step back. They take like an above view of the meta and go, I just want to control all of this, and I can achieve that with this deck. So that making top cut, of course, no one should underestimate that. And I think Ruby Sapphire now moves into the role that Ruby Amethyst has been in for the past previous sets, where whenever you build a deck, you need to think, right, and how is my matchup into Ruby Sapphire? Because in the previous previous sets, whenever I built a deck, it's always been, and what's my Ruby Amethyst matchup like? But I think now it's looking more like, and what's my Ruby Sapphire matchup like? Just because of the sheer volume of people who will play it and bring it to an event. Of course, that's going to affect my choice of blue steel going forward, and I have been looking at a few other decks as well, just because I'll be attending Seattle, and I just want to mix things up a bit. But yeah, I think Ruby Sapphire's come into that dominant top spot, and it's also to the point where I used to recommend to anyone who's new to the game Ruby Amethyst. Probably would recommend them Ruby Sapphire now. You don't play a solitaire game, but you can, if you're new to a TCG, you can just learn your lines very well. The mulligan, I wouldn't say is simple, but you know what you want to get. You want to get that ramp. You want to get like Porp Ramp Hiram or Porp or Ramp Tala, and just get yourself into a really controlling spot. So I think that would probably be the one I'd suggest from now on to people. I don't think it's fairly pricey in TCG terms. Of course, Ruby Amethyst is still cheaper, but as we can see, the suggested prices here. But yeah, I think Ruby Sapphire is now the deck that you have to try and beat or have a decent game into, no matter how you build your deck basically. And then Steel Song is the other one that we all thought would just wreck it and just go to the top and get loads of top finishes. But actually, I think even in there wasn't that many day two finishes for Steel Song in Birmingham. There's a few more it seems, but not as many in Vegas either. And I think that's just down to the Ruby Sapphire. I think there's a few aspects at play here. Ruby Sapphire is of course going to gatekeep it very much. It has such a strong matchup into that. That's a matchup they would want. I think that benefited them as well this past weekend because they had the second most popular deck. So instead of just playing mirrors, they also had a chance to play against a deck that they very confidently can 2-0. So it just basically kind of got gatekeeped, and the matchups that Steel Song wants is it's well, it wants anything that's not Ruby Sapphire to begin with. But it wants to go against other steel decks, I assume, and I would say that's their best thing. And then they want to be aggro decks as well. I think that's another thing for them to feed off of. But they just most of them would have fizzled out, and then they would just ended up getting matched up against Ruby Sapphire, and sadly would have just lost out on getting a good enough score to make cut. So I think going forward, maybe a lot of the Steelsong players might come away from those events and go, well, that wasn't that great because I just played against a lot of control decks that beat me. And I think as well, Steelsong goes into the same category as what Blue Steel is that it is focusing on the wheel and it's focusing on benefiting from doing really good high rolls. And sometimes your deck's just not going to function. You're going to say, right, I'm going to draw 7 cards, and those 7 cards have to be good, and they could all be terrible. Just variables, just the way it's going to work out. And across 9 rounds in a best of 2 format where you need to be 2-0ing matchups, sometimes it's just not going to be consistent enough. You're going to get a lot of 2-0s, but then of course you're going to have those games where they should have been a 2-0 if you were maybe like playing a deck that was just a bit more consistent in its nature. So overall, Steelsong, I just feel it's fallen behind a little bit, sadly, and you can still pilot to a win. I still think it's a respectable deck to bring. It's still insanely powerful. There's loads of good builds of it with Lantern or with the Daisy, but yeah, it just felt like it was a bit gatekeeped by how powerful Ruby Sapphire is. And I think as well, even in Vegas, the Green Steel players, their decks were built in a way that they didn't mind the matchup into Steelsong, so they were having fun there as well. And yeah, so I think Steelsong possibly might drop down a few percent, but it's still going to be a huge, around 20% meta share just because of how powerful the deck is. Something to mention as well, I've noticed how many of the hyper aggro decks sort of ended up getting to the top cut. I think you bring that deck and you pray for the best run you can get. I think everything besides Steelsong, you probably should be fine. So Ruby Amethyst, of course, brilliant run there. Ruby Sapphire, brilliant run, and then possibly just from the nature of aggressive lore gain, you can get your way through a lot of the other matchups. If you're playing as a discard thing, like such as Lemon and Lime, you can just use the Chromacon and just be like, I burn. But even still, they've got bouncers, the muses, and sometimes you can just catch people off guard. I mean, what hyper aggro does quite well is puts your opponent in a position where you say like, right, and you have to perfectly answer everything, otherwise I'm just going to gain lore and go over you, which they can do. But I played a hyper aggro this week, and on the play, I got double grab your swords, double Tinkerbell, and it was just game out. Game done. On the draw, didn't see any of them, and you're on the draw, so you're behind already. If they're going to go Daisy or Daisy Piglet, and you're not finding any of your answers for that matchup, you're just going to fall behind and lose, sadly. And that's just the nature of hyper aggro. It's going to completely ignore you. It's just going to do what it wants to do, which is just race for lore and say, if you haven't got answers, I'm going to win this matchup, sadly. So I don't think that was unexpected. To see some of them make the cut, you've just got to have a really good run, and yeah, it's hyper aggro. It's been the way it is in every TCG. That's exactly how they play. I used to play in Pokemon with hyper aggro decks, and you were like, right, I bring this, I wouldn't say I play a fair game, but I know I just needed the run and the certain matchups versus certain decks, and you just kind of go, well, if I bring hyper aggro, and the most popular right now is a hyper control deck that wants to basically focus on not controlling the board early on and wants to ramp, you could just have a good run against them and get a 2-0. So yeah, I think that's definitely was a choice, and I think going forward as well, that was a matchup that a lot of players just then I don't even want to practice it because I'm not going to see it very much, and I'd be surprised if you talk to someone who didn't see one or saw the deck being played around on tables near them. So yeah, hyper aggro is here and it's here to stay, which is I'm quite excited about because I think Lorcana does needs aggro decks and hyper aggro decks as well. I think it's good for the meta. I think it just makes it more diverse, in my opinion. So and it keeps these control decks a bit more in check as well. It's a bit sad to see how the meta works out because Ruby Sapphire is at the top. Steelsong, it feeds off the Steelsong, and the Steelsong feeds off the hyper aggro. So it's kind of like there's this buffer between the hyper aggro and the Ruby Sapphire, because the hyper aggro wants to kill the Ruby Sapphire, the hyper control deck, but in the middle you've got the Steelsong deck that beats them and knocks them out, and then Ruby Sapphire feeds on the Steelsong. So it's kind of this weird not great circle there, where the Steel Song deck should, in a sense, have a good matchup because it's the mid-range deck into the one above, which is the control deck, and it should have a good matchup into the one below, but it shouldn't stomp them out of the matchup, right? It's usually how these things work. Hyper aggro takes control, mid-range has a fair game into both of them, and control just takes the just well, it does control things. It should also have a good matchup into all of them as well, and it should do all right into the mid range, but it should lose quite hard to the what's it called, to the aggro. So it's kind of like a meter of mid range in the middle, aggro on one side, control on the other. So I'm going to stop that rambling because I hope none of that made sense. Well, I hope some of it did. I think Lemon Lime as well. It was good to note that it's sort of the outsider deck. That's another one I really want to play and look into. I quite like a deck that's very strong meta based, but it doesn't have a good turnout just because it doesn't, for whatever reason, it's complex or people don't have enough faith into it. That's interesting, but that's just offside, I think I'm going to say, a red steel deck in there. But and green purple I mentioned just before I go on to my last point. Green purple, yeah, that's proven itself to be a very strong deck. I think it's kind of in the Ruby Amethyst realm of it plays itself a fair game. It does use the green discards package as well with the Ursula. But it's just, you just have to slog out a lot of matchups there, and if you're very skilled and understand the interactions and where you gain your lore and when you lose your lore, and how to control a board, I think it just generally can have a really good run. So yeah, Emerald Amethyst is here to stay, and that's another one to think about in the matchup field when you play. I played two on the weekend, and it feels like Steel was still very strong into them, especially when they're playing cards like Banzai and stuff like that, and their board primarily can still be wiped by a Grab Your Swords Tinkerbell. So yeah, they're here to stay. They just feel like they go into the category of Ruby Amethyst, just a different version of it, because they use a discard package and they try and disrupt in tempo instead. So yeah, I don't think there's much more to say on that deck. It's just going to be around. The one thing I did expect to see, I did note, and I didn't see many of them, but there's one there, was I think when you get a top 64, you usually get a splattering of loads of other different decks. In Birmingham, that looks like it's a bit more the case. You've got a purple in there and a purple steel. I was expecting a little bit more purple steel, especially as a lot of the purple steel players had announced that the deck is just pretty good into both Ruby Sapphire and Steel Song. Don't take my word for that. That's just me being told that by a bunch of Steel Song players. I'm not actually sure about the win rates into those matchups, but they seemed quite confident when I was talking to a lot of Amethyst Steel players when I was going into the weekend. But to see only, I've just scrolled down and saw one in the Birmingham cut, and to see none in the Vegas cut does surprise me, because you again play quite a fair game. There's two actually. You use the Amethyst package to draw quite consistently with the bounces and friends on the other side, and then you just use Steel to control the board. So if a person with a good game knowledge and a good amount of reps on the deck should be able to win a good game against Steel Song. And then of course you can aggressively lore quest against Ruby Sapphire, and then tend to have a bad matchup into Ruby Amethyst because they're doing the same thing. They're just doing it with the Ruby package. So in that matchup, they should come out on top. But I was saddened to see that not a lot of them turned up as much. A lot of people were hyping repeat as well, just to lock out any actions and just play a very awkward game. But yeah, it looks like we haven't seen much of that here. But yeah, overall, I think this is just how the meta was going to shape out. The green steer was one to think about. Maybe it was quite a bit of a jump the gun to just drop it very soon after the Bucky errata happened. But yeah, this is exactly what you expect to see. And I think going forward, you just play the deck you wanted to play. If Steel Song, you turned up with Steel Song on the weekend and it wasn't what you liked, that's fine. I think even with Lamb doing a very good run of Blue Steel, if you are a Blue Steel player, you're going to have to play a little harder. Your deck's not as strong as it used to be, but you can still bring it and play. There was a lot of them that got the Let It Go promos, which is still quite a good run in terms of the amount of turnout you get with 2,000 people to get a card that's worth like $500 or whatever is pretty nice as well. So I still think, yeah, just play what you want. None of the meta was insanely different besides the green steel that turned up. So yeah, I think that's some stuff to talk about on the past weekend's events.